The Sherman Players presents Scares from the Playhouse. Turn off the light, close your eyes, and listen to our tale. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin.
This is an excerpt from The Man of Science by Jerome K. Jerome. I was told a story this morning at the hospital by an old French doctor. The actual facts are few and simple. All that is known can be read in the Paris police records of 62 years ago. The most important part of the case, however, is the part that is not known, and that will never be known. The story begins with a great wrong done by one man onto another man. What the wrong was, I do not know. I am inclined to think, however, it was connected with a woman. I think that because he who had been wronged hated who had wronged him with a hate such as does not often burn in a man's brain, unless it is fanned by the memory of a woman's breath. Still, that is only conjecture, and the point is immaterial. The man who had done the wrong fled, and the other man followed him. It became a point-to-point race, the first man having the advantage of a day's start. The course was the whole world, and the stakes were the first man's life. Travelers were few and far between in those days, and this made the trail easy to follow. The first man, never knowing how far or how near the other man was behind him, and hoping now and again that he might have baffled him, would rest for a while. The second man, knowing always just how far the first one was before him, never paused, and thus each day the man who was spurred by hate drew nearer to the man who was spurred by fear. One day the man who was ridden by fear looked up and saw before him the open door of a cathedral, and, passing in, knelt down and prayed. He prayed long and fervently, for men, when they are in sore straits, clutch eagerly at the straws of faith. He prayed that he might be forgiven his sin, and, more important still, that he might be pardoned the consequences of his sin, and be delivered from his adversary. And a few chairs from him, facing him, knelt his enemy, praying also. But the second man's prayer, being a thanksgiving merely, was short, so that when the first man raised his eyes, he saw the face of his enemy gazing at him across the chair tops, with a mocking smile upon it. He made no attempt to rise, but remained kneeling, fascinated by the look of joy that shone out of the other man's eyes. And the other man moved the high-backed chairs, one by one, and came towards him softly. Then, just as the man who had been wronged stood beside the man who had wronged him, full of gladness that his opportunity had come, there burst from the cathedral tower a sudden clash of bells, and the man whose opportunity had come broke his heart and fell back dead, with that mocking smile still playing round his mouth. And so he lay there. Then the man who had done the wrong rose up and passed out, praising God. What became of the body of the other man is not known. It was the body of a stranger who had died suddenly in the cathedral. There was none to identify it, none to claim it. Years passed away, and the survivor in the tragedy became a worthy and useful citizen, and a noted man of science. In his laboratory were many objects necessary to him in his researches, and, prominent among them, stood in a certain corner a human skeleton. It was a very old and much mended skeleton, and one day the long-expected end arrived, and it tumbled to pieces. Thus it became necessary to purchase another. The man of science visited a dealer he well knew, a little parchment-faced old man who kept a dingy shop where nothing was ever sold within the shadow of the towers of Notre Dame. The little parchment-faced old man had just the very thing that Monsieur wanted: a singularly fine and well-proportioned study. It should be sent round and set up in Monsieur's laboratory that very afternoon. The dealer was as good as his word. When Monsieur entered his laboratory that evening, the thing was in its place. Monsieur seated himself in his high-backed chair and tried to collect his thoughts. But Monsieur's thoughts were unruly and inclined to wander, and to wander always in one direction. Monsieur opened a large volume and commenced to read. He read of a man who had wronged another and fled from him, the other man following. Finding himself reading this, he closed the book angrily and went and stood by the window and looked out. He saw before him the sun-pierced nave of a great cathedral, and on the stones lay a dead man with a mocking smile upon his face. Cursing himself a fool, he turned away with a laugh. But his laugh was short-lived, for it seemed to him that something else in the room was laughing also. Struck suddenly still, with his feet glued to the ground, he stood listening for a while, then sought with starting eyes the corner from where the sound had seemed to come. But the white thing standing there was only grinning. Monsieur wiped the damp sweat from his head and hands and stole out. For a couple of days he did not enter the room again. On the third, telling himself that his fears were those of a hysterical girl, he opened the door and went in. To shame himself, he took his lamp in his hand, and crossing over to the corner where the skeleton stood, examined it. A set of bones bought for 300 francs. Was he a child to be scared by such a bogey? He held his lamp up in front of the thing's grinning head. The flame of the lamp flickered as though a faint breath had passed over it. The man explained this to himself by saying that the walls of the house were old and cracked, and that the wind might creep in anywhere. He recrossed the room, sat down, and gripped the arms of his chair till his fingers turned white. He tried to work. The empty sockets in that grinning head seemed to be drawing him towards them. He rose and battled with his inclination to fly, screaming from the room. Glancing fearfully about him, his eye fell upon a high screen standing before the door. He dragged it forward and placed it between himself and the thing so that he could not see it, nor it see him. Then he sat down again to his work. For a while he forced himself to look at the book in front of him, but at last, unable to control himself any longer, he suffered his eyes to follow their own bent. It may have been an hallucination. He may have accidentally placed the screen so as to favor such an illusion. But what he saw was a bony hand coming round the corner of the screen, and with a cry he fell to the floor in a swoon. The people of the house came running in, and lifting him up, carried him out, and laid him upon his bed. As soon as he recovered, his first question was, where had they found the thing? Where was it when they entered the room? And when they told him they had seen it standing where it always stood, they tried to hide their smiles. So for many months the laboratory door remained locked. Then there came a chill autumn evening where the man of science opened it again and closed it behind him. He lighted his lamp and gathered his instruments and books around him. He sat down before them in his high-backed chair, and the old terror returned to him. But this time he meant to conquer himself. His nerves were stronger now, and his brain clearer. He would fight his unreasoning fear. He crossed to the door and locked himself in and flung the key to the other end of the room, where it fell among jars and bottles with an echoing clatter. Later on, his old housekeeper, going her final round, tapped at his door and wished him good night, as was her custom. She received no response at first, and, growing nervous, tapped louder and called again, and at length an answering "Good night" came back to her. She thought little about it at the time, but afterwards she remembered that the voice that had replied to her had been strangely grating and mechanical. Trying to describe it, she likened it to such a voice as she would imagine coming from a statue. Next morning, his door remained still locked. It was no unusual thing for him to work all night and far into the next day, so no one thought to be surprised. When, however, evening came, and yet he did not appear, his servants gathered outside the room and whispered, remembering what had happened once before. They listened, but could hear no sound. They shook the door and called to him, then beat with their fists upon the wooden panels. But still no sound came from the room. Becoming alarmed, they decided to burst open the door, and after many blows it gave way and they crowded in. He sat bolt upright in his high-backed chair. They thought at first he had died in his sleep, but when they drew nearer and the light fell upon him, they saw the livid marks of bony fingers round his throat, and in his eyes there was a terror such as not often seen in human eyes.
A Man of Science by Jerome K. Jerome was read by John Squires. This has been a Sherman Players production.
A Ghost Story by Mark Twain. I took a large room far up Broadway in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years, until I came. Now, the place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence, and I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead that first night I climbed up to my quarters. For the first time in my life, a superstitious dread came over me, and as I turned a dark angle of the stairway, an invisible cobweb swung its slazy woof in my face, and it clung there. I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold and the darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there, thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes, summoning up half-forgotten faces out of the midst of the past, listening and fancied the voices that long ago grew silent for all time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds outside softened to a wail. The angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the streets subsided until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I rose and undressed, moving tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in my bed and lay listening to the rain and the wind and the faint creaking of distant shutters till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly. For how long I do not know, because all at once I found myself awake and filled with a shuddering expectancy. Now all was still, all but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently the bedclothes began to slip away slowly toward the foot of the bed as if someone were pulling them. Now I could not stir, I could not speak. Still the blankets slipped deliberately away until my breast was uncovered. And then, with a great effort, I seized them and drew them over my head. I waited, listened, waited. And once more that steady pull began. And once more I lay torpid, a century of dragging seconds, till my breast was naked again. And at last I roused my energies and snatched the covers back to the place, and I held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by I felt a tug, and took a fresh grip, and the tug strengthened to a steady strain, and it grew stronger and stronger. My whole body, for the third time, the blanket slipped away. I groaned. An answering groan came back from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently I heard a heavy footstep in my room. It's the step of an elephant. Seemed to me it was not like anything human, but it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving bolt or lock, and wandered away among the dismal corridors, straining the floor joists till they creaked again as it passed. And then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream, simply a hideous dream." And so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream. And then a comforting laugh relaxed my lips, and I was happy again. I got up and struck a light, and when I found that the locks and the bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire when down went the pipe out of my nerveless fingers. My blood forsook my cheeks, my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes of the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast that in comparison mine was but an infant's. Then I had a visitor, and the elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and I returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay for a long time, peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead, like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor, and then throwing down of the body, and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building, I heard the muffled slam of the doors. I heard at intervals stealthy footsteps creeping in and out among the corridors and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door. They hesitated and they went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages and listened while the clanking drew nearer, while it wearily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chain that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently in the swish of invisible garments, the rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my chamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathing about my bed, mysterious whisperings, and 3 little spears of soft phosphorescent light appeared up on the ceiling directly over my head. They clung and they glowed there for a minute, and then they dropped, 2 of them on my face, 1 on my pillow. They spattered liquidly, felt warm. Intuition told me they turned into gouts of blood as they fell, and I needed no light to satisfy myself of that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous, and white uplifted hands floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased, and the voices and the sounds in a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward a sitting posture. My face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass out the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed. I was sick, feeble, and I lit the gas with a hand that trembled as if it were aged 100 years. The light brought some little cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. And by and by, its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. And in that same moment, I heard that elephantine tread again. I noted its approach, nearer and nearer, along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me lay in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge, cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale gold stole over the whole thing, and gradually its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, and then legs, and then a body, and then at last a great sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come with that benignant countenance. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them the gas flamed up brightly. Never a lonely outcast was so glad to welcome company as I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why, it's nobody but you. Do you know that I have been scared to death for the last 2-3 hours? I am most honestly glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit in that thing." Oh, but it was too late. He was in it before I could stop him, and down he went. I never saw a chair shivered so in my life. Now stop, you'll ruin It's too late again. It was another crash, and another chair was resolved to its original elements. Now, confound it, have you no judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture on the place? Here, you petrified fool. But it was no use. Before I could arrest him, he sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. Now, what sort of a way is that to do? Now, first you come lumbering about the place, bringing a legion of vagabond goblins with you all to worry me to death, and then when I overlook the indelicacy of costume, which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people except in a respectable theater, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can find to sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You have broken off the end of your spinal column and littered up the floor with chips of your hams, and the place looks like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're big enough to know better. Well, I will not break any more furniture. What am I to do? I have not had the chance to sit down for a century. And the tears came into his eyes. Oh, you poor devil, I said. I should not have been so harsh with you. And you are an orphan too, no doubt. But sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight. And besides, we cannot be sociable with you way up there above me. I want you down here where I can perch on this high counting house stool and gossip with you face to face. So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe, which I gave him. I threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire and exposed the flat, honeycomb bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. What is the matter with the bottom of your feet and the back of your legs that they are gouged up so? Infernal chilblains. I caught them near up the back of my head, roosting out there on the Newell's farm. But I love the place. I love it as one loves his old home. There's no peace for me like peace I feel when I'm there. We talked for a long half hour, and then I noticed that he looked tired and spoke of it. Tired, he said. Well, I should think so. And now I will tell you about it, since you have treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street there in that museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff giant. I can have no rest, no peace, till they have given that poor body burial again. Now, what was the most natural thing for me to do to make men satisfy this wish? Terrify them into it, haunt the place where the body lay. So I haunted the museum night after night. I even got the elder spirits to help me. But it did no good, for nobody ever came to the museum at midnight. And then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing, I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that perdition could furnish. Night after night we have shivered around through these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, traipsing up and down stairs till, to tell you the truth, I am almost worn out. But when I saw a light in your room tonight, I roused my energies again and went at it with a deal of old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope. I lit off my perch in a burst of excitement and exclaimed, this transcends everything, everything that ever did occur. Why, you poor blundering old fossil, you have had all your troubles for nothing. You have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff giant is in Albany. Confound it, don't y'all know your own remains? I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation overspread a countenance before. The petrified man rose slowly to his feet and said, honestly, is that true? As true as I'm sitting here. He took the pipe from his mouth and he laid it on the mantel, and then stood irresolute a moment, unconsciously from old habit, thrusting his hands where his pantaloon pockets should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, "Well, I never felt so absurd before. A petrified man has sold everybody else. Now the mean old fraud has ended by selling his own ghost. My son, if there was any charity left in your heart for a poor friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. Think how you would feel if you had made such an ass of yourself." I heard his stately tramp die away, step by step, down the stairs and out into the deserted street, and I felt sorry that he was gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he had carried off my red blanket and my bathtub.
A Ghost Story by Mark Twain was read by Francis Daley. This has been a Sherman Players production.